The nuclear arms race started in 1945 after the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Japan to end World War II. After this happened, the Soviet Union started building their own nuclear missiles in 1949, which led to tensions between the U.S. and the USSR. After World War II, the USSR and the Allies controlled all of Europe, and the Allies controlled half of Berlin. After the war, the US sent money to its occupied territories. Now, the half of Berlin that they controlled was built into a better place compared to the industrial side that the USSR controlled. The USSR built a wall in between the city as Cuba turned into a communist country. The USSR became friends with them and moved some of their missiles there. Seeing this, the US paid rebels to attack Cuba from the inside and sent little air support. This invasion failed due to the lack of support the US sent. They sent so little because they didn't want to be a big part of the war. Now that the USSR and Cuba were close, the USSR prepared for a full nuclear war in 1962.
The U.S. also assembled themselves, but at the last second, the two sides came to an agreement and they both moved their missiles away because the Soviet Union said they would move theirs if the U.S. didn't attack Cuba. Even though they still hated each other, they never attacked and decided to fight smaller proxy wars like the Vietnam War or the Korean War. The USSR's new leader allowed their territories in East Europe to hold their own elections, and this led to the Berlin Wall being destroyed and the end of the Cold War in 1991.
Did you know that Chicago and many other major American metropolitan areas were involved in the Cold War as well? Chicago used to have night missile sites dotted near and around the city. The purpose of these sites was to be prepared for a Soviet nuclear attack and to show off the power of the United States military. One famous launch site is located right behind the Museum of Science and Industry. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union will begin before World War II is even over. The two atomic bombs dropped on Japan will foster a Cold War between the two superpowers and create a nuclear arms race. A nuclear arms race that will be responsible for numerous proxy wars throughout the world.
We need to show how our projects broke new frontiers. Our project has broken many frontiers, like nuclear missiles, for example. This is a new frontier because it's an advancement in science and technology and also politics. People from many different places have been included and worked on the nuclear arms race to outsmart, outshow, and impress enemies and even sometimes allies. Even though there is danger and death around atomic bombs, the race showed how competitive people can be over anything at any time. The US and Soviet Union were aware that other people might not have liked their rules, but they believed they were spreading what they thought was good for a good reason, even if it benefited them more than anyone else, in some cases.
When the people in charge established their way of government, they wanted more power and influence to spread their way of government and nuclear power. It was one way to show the dominance against each other, though after no direct conflict, they found that influencing smaller countries could be a better way to spread their ideologies. This led to proxy wars. These proxy wars, such as the Vietnam War or the Korean War, were violent ways to spread ideologies, but it was some of the only ways, though in most cases, the communists were the only ones on the attack. Some of these wars successfully spread communism or capitalism or democracy, but some were just defending a country from turning into the opposite government.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union, things like proxy wars stopped happening and communism slowly started to disappear, but it is still one of the most prominent forms of government today. Even though the Soviet Union is no more, the effects of the proxy wars can still be seen today, like Vietnam and China being communist or Paraguay and Malaysia being democratic. These are just a few of the many lasting effects of the Cold War proxy wars. The Korean War was a war between North and South Korea, where the Soviet-backed North crossed the 38th parallel and invaded the South. The Soviet Union supported the North so they could spread communism. After they pushed the South Koreans back to Busan, the US and other countries who supported the South fought for the land the North Koreans and Soviets took from them, leading to a bloody war, but eventually a peace treaty was signed that gave South Korea more land. This is an example of a proxy war where countries fight with each other through other countries. In this situation, the US and USSR fought through the Koreas.
This quote shows how the Soviet Union spread their ideologies of communism using a different way other than nuclear war. This is important because it conveys that the Soviet Union is realizing that there are different ways to spread communism other than nuclear weapons, therefore proving her point that the nuclear arms race created the Cold War proxy wars and a lot of other tensions between the US and the Soviet Union.
The Vietnam War was a proxy war between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North, led by Ho Chi Minh and backed by the Soviet Union. The South was led by No Diem and assisted by the United States. The Soviet Union wanted to continue to spread their belief of communism, and the US wanted to defend their ideology of capitalism.
It started due to the tensions between the North and the South. The USSR and the US both aided their allies when the war started but didn't fully engage until later in the war. Also involved in the war was Laos. They got involved because of the civil war going on between neutralists, communists, and royalists in their country. South Vietnam and the US supported the neutralists and royalists, while North Vietnam, with help from China and the USSR, supported the communists. This became one of the most prominent parts of the war. Cambodia was also involved later in the war. The North Vietnamese had a big advantage because of the conditions the war was fought in, the jungle. So even though the war was very bloody, Vietnam unified under communist rule in 1975.
The quote above shows that the Vietnam War led to one thing and another, just like the dominoes mentioned. It all went down in the end. If you decide to invade and spread your way to other places, other people will interfere, support sides, and help. If one country falls to communism, the others will as well. The US entered the war because they were worried about the domino effect. This shows how the US became worried about what would happen in the proxy wars due to the fact that they realized they were not going to get involved in a nuclear conflict, therefore proving our claim that the nuclear missiles created the Cold War proxy wars.
The Arab-Israeli conflict is a conflict between Israel and Palestine. It started after Israel got independence from the British, which caused Palestine to become very angry because they took all of their land, therefore starting a war. The U.S. backed up Israel, and the Soviet Union backed up Palestine, resulting in a proxy war.
The whole conflict consisted of many wars spanning from 1948 to present, and right now Israel still has most of the territory, though Palestine is making small fronts. Israel now has nuclear weapons, making it the dominant power. The U.S. is still involved, but not as heavily as it was earlier in the conflict when the Soviet Union still existed.
This quote shows that the proxy wars between the Soviet Union and the U.S. are still main obstacles for peace today, even if they weren't created by either country. Some conflicts that the US and Soviet Union were involved in are still conflicts today, which shows the after effect of these things. This proves our point by showing how the Soviet Union used countries like Palestine to try to accomplish their goal of making the world communist because other ways didn't work. Henceforth, the nuclear arms race.
Ultimately, all these pieces of information and evidence show that the Cold War proxy wars were created by the nuclear arms race. They do this by showing how other countries got involved with the wars, resulting in proxy wars between the US and Soviet Union. This happened because the countries were trying to get others to agree to settle down their government forms, which developed more tensions.